Hello, everyone. As we wait, let people in. Please feel free to share where you're joining us from in the chat. It looks like we have an international audience today, which makes it even better. Um, Let me start by introducing myself in the meantime. My name is Hüseyin Arıkan. I'm a program assistant for virtual events at the Black Mountain Institute at UNLV and a creative writing MFA poetry student. Here at UNLV, I'm happy to welcome you all to Poetry and Resistance, a conversation with Farid Matuk. This afternoon, we'll get to hear Farid Matuk read from his work, and we'll have a conversation focused on his latest poetry collection, Moon Mirrored Indivisible, which came out from the University of Chicago Press last year. It is a conversation that I've been looking forward to for a long time, so I'm glad that it's happening finally today. Before I introduce our guest, though, allow me to express our gratitude to those who made today possible. Black Mountain Institute would like to thank its supporters, Beverly Rogers, Miriam Shearing, and the Rogers Foundation. A big thank you to Farid for being with us today, and thank you everyone in our audience for joining us. Um, Last but not least, the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, wishes to acknowledge and honor the indigenous communities of this region and recognize that the university is situated on the traditional homelands of the Nuvu Southern Paiute people. We offer gratitude for the land itself, for those who have stewarded it for generations, and for the opportunity to study, learn, work, and be in community with this land. We encourage everyone in this space to engage in continued learning about the indigenous people who work and live on this land since time immemorial, including the Las Vegas Paiute tribe and the Moapa Band of Paiutes. Farid Matuk is the author of the poetry collections This is a Nice Neighborhood, The Real Horse, and Moon Mirrored Indivisible. With artist Nancy Friedemann-Sánchez, Matuk created the book arts project Redolent, recipient of the 2023 Anna Rabinowitz Prize from the Poetry Society of America. Matuk is also the translator of Tilsa Otta's selected poems, The Hormone of Darkness, that came out from the Graywolf Press in 2024. Matuk's work has been supported by the Headlands Center for the Arts, a Holloway Lectureship in the Practice of Poetry at UC Berkeley, and a 2024 USA Fellowship. It is a great honor for me to introduce Farid Matuk, and please allow me to welcome Farid.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really, really grateful to Hüseyin for reading the work and wanting to be in conversation about it, and Black Mountain for hosting us, and all of you for being here. Thank you so much. I'm going to recite a couple of poems. Bear with me. I'm trying this new vulnerable thing of memorizing some of the works. Of mule and deer, of a tin cold and murmuring black wood, lightly you lope, pale deer, lifting a story from pages of snow. Nothing turns in your eye. And toward a tin cold and murmuring black wood, I bear a display case of blue light. Say it was the sky. Say all you want. It was the sky. All right, you light-headed father. I'd ask for rain. Wait until January because I'll be born with a sash. This is where you shit? This is a drawer for aftershave? Learning your things. Systems that churn hundreds of years. Earns harrowing honors that get smeared. Some of it sticks. Mean it could accept thing exists like a pine cone opening. But for daddy's spit raining down, isn't the same thing also the tree's many a small mouth? I hear of sovereignties. I hear of the first world. But having survived facing off against the progeny, ancestors, I'm told, will be no prophylactics against it. And in our bodies, there are no borders, the new Aeromexico ad says. So here come the killers and their retors. Elliot Abrams, John Bolton, Juan Zarate of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Here, I'm told, is a song. George Zimmerman, whose countrymen. And I'll close with this poem a little bit longer, so I really want to try it if I can do this. It's called Sentences Upon Emergent Devotions, and it's in the voice of a devil. Having been called a mammon, a Belial, all the devil aspect to which you would dedicate a man in himself now happen close enough to consciousness to taste what words would go to what mouths. Don't call it ingenious use of the materials and signs that would carry this thinly distributed body until imagination abandons, leaving only the most basic men, auto-tuned, strobe effect, hypno video voiced, coaching upper huffs, narrow the world into something you can swallow yourselves down and out, recycling pit in perfect loops. Transaction pleased? Will you speak? I don't care enough to hear you. I see you receiving what night and wind, gravel dust, and easement lights over the safe and private yard. Will you heal? What do you think you're asking? You dress me in horns, in muscles, in tongues. You take only one light from my eyes. You rage. You remember to breathe. You use and wipe and smear. You think the mountain is rising, decorated in its metals when your dreams only take you into small rooms to come. The wind finally gets free enough to run through you, and you think it rushes at a hillside that must lift my throat. Does it matter, raven or crow, that you swear visits always and only over your left shoulder, when you are this grateful to be in its downcast, yellow.
Thank you so much for that great reading. I think I can I understand the vulnerability that comes with reciting poetry from memory, from a really bad memory that I had when I was in middle school, and ever since I swore that I would never do it again. Um, I understand and see and celebrate the your choice to uh, confront that vulnerability, and thank you. Um, I have a lot of questions, and I don't know where to start. But since one of the poems that you recited mentioned John Bolton, I had a question about the urgency that contributed into the emergence of this collection. The book came out in March 2025, and it is in very much in conversation with the political questions of our time. I'm thinking of the mentions of the U.S. military in the book, of Proud Boys and NoFap, of how you situate body horror, um, and of course with what's going on in with Iran right now. I'm sure John Bolton is really happy to see that his vision is being executed. Um, I was wondering if if the time that passed since March 2025, which was when Moon Mirrored Indivisible came out, has contributed to the urgency that shaped this collection.
I mean, since publication, it might, or it might for readers or for the way that people talk poetry. There's, I think, a misalignment and a dissonance between the conversations that we have about poetry soon after a book comes out and the actual work and the conversations we might have about that work years to come. So often the conversation that happens around a book in a moment is reactive to what's going on. I'm a relatively slow writer. This book, previous one came out in 2018. I think I really started writing in earnest toward this in 2020. So about 5 years publication. So the book is processing things that are political questions and energies and tendencies that have been going. In the mention of John Bolton, he's in a constellation there with other folks who have advanced U.S. interests across. And then, so thinking about, I was born in Peru to a Syrian family, complicated lineage. I do think a lot about the relationship between the U.S. and the places that it kind of totally colonizes and not so subtle. Thinking about what did those folks do? And I'm also thinking from 2016 till now, we've had a chance to really reckon with nationalist movements emerge. And so studied and seen is that there's a real reciprocity between far right in Latin America and far right in the US. It's not just a relationship of imposition. It's not just that the US is something. There's actual reciprocity where more folks than you would want to know in every Latin American country are thrilled to have a racist, nationalist system of government. Lately, really haunted by an image of Trump. At least one of the participants was wearing a T-shirt that said, Pinochet did nothing wrong. Pinochet was the murderous dictator in Chile, the United States. Um, so, so the work is slow. The work is trying to disentangle things that energies that are ongoing, have been ongoing. And so I'm not sure that the most current moment is something I can speak to in a thoughtful way, other than to trace what I think continues.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. What so I understand and I appreciate your point about how a book comes to be. And my next question maybe can be related to that about how a this manuscript, this collection came together, because there is a clear there's a clear set of structural choices all throughout. In a Lit Hub interview, you also mentioned that each section forms somewhat of an essay, and poem. There are references in poems to preceding poems. If you could tell us a little bit about how this book came to be and how you decided to settle with on this current structure and organization of the collection.
Yeah, thank you. So at the level of craft, at the line and at the poem, the book was reactive against my second book. So I really wanted to push against what I was trying to learn in the second book. And what I was trying to learn in the second book was how to create quasi-sonnets, right? 14-line poems that were self-contained, but also syntactically literally had a slippage so that one phrase could modify what was before it and what was ahead of it. So I practiced that a lot. It created a very kind of soupy and aquatic feeling as you're reading, through. So the 14-line poem would be like an aquarium, right? And the lines are kind of sloshing water inside the aquarium. And of course, in sections, I wanted the poems to speak to each other. So I wanted to react against that in this third book, just to set myself up to learn and to practice other things. So I started capitalizing the first letter of every line to kind of very self-consciously declare these as poetry with a capital P. I wanted many, if not all of the poems to sit on a single page. I wanted most of them to uh, be generous to the reader in isolation, right? So if they were to appear in a journal, they could be a complete experience. So that's what I was trying to learn kind of formally at the level of the poem in line with this book. And also to have more of an intentional sense of prosody inside the line. And we can talk about that later. At the level of structure for the book, there comes a point I've learned when I'm revising, when I become much more interested in the form of the book than in the form of the poem. And so that is when I start to sequence poems in sections so that they do talk to each other. I just find that seductive because you can say more in a section than you can, or I can say more in a section than I can in a single poem. I'm sure other people can achieve more in a single poem than I can. Another thing that was really illuminating just conceptually that then fed into the structure was that I saw an exhibition at the Contemporary here in Tucson, the Museum of Contemporary Art that we have here. It's really one of these museums that punches way above its weight for being in a relatively small city. We had this amazing artist named Na Mira, so first name N-A, last name M-I-R-A, who I believe is based in Los Angeles. By the way, she has a terrific book called The Book of Na that was put out by the press Wendy's Subway. I can't recommend it enough. So she did an installation here that had many aspects, but one of them, you had to walk up to a dark corner and there was a projector up or a monitor up above with flashing words. And to read them, you had to look down at a piece of glass that she had put on the ground. So it looked like you were looking down into a well to read this text. And so that amplified for me the idea of mirrors, and that then led to the poems in the book that kind of punctuate the sections where there's a phrase, there's a line that's meant to represent a mirror, and then there's an imprecise reflection of that phrase. And that also, at the same time, I was doing that heavy translation project with Tilsa Otta's poems and thinking a lot about translation. And so mirroring became a way to think about how relationally, we come up to each other and we can't exactly mirror back. We always mirror back with a difference. And that's what I think translation is. It's not an attempt to approximate or to carry over. it's an extension. And in extending what the source material was, you create difference with it, right? So the most extreme articulation I can find of this that I can share is when I was an undergraduate. Jacques Derrida was still alive. He would come to my university every spring. He was a visiting professor, and I watched him over several weeks work through 2 or maybe 3 paragraphs of Heidegger's Being and Time. And to do that, he would come with the French, the German, and the English editions and read from all three. And the implication or the lesson that I took away is that there is no way Heidegger's own German could have been enough for Heidegger's own thoughts. So the intention of the author and the language that in which the author operates most closely is great. It's one thing, but that cannot be the horizon. The work in the possibilities of the work extend beyond what the author could have intended in a single language. So then in that case, the French and the English are not poor approximations. They're ways to tease out threads that were latent in the German, right? So that's translation. This book is not about translation, but the idea of mirroring came from watching that exhibition by Namira, and it kind of expanded in my head to all these ways that we do relational work with each other. And we cannot help but distort each other. And that distortion doesn't have to be a place of sadness. It can be a place of expansion.
Thank you. The your your response made me think of multiple things at once. I believe each of which can help expand our conversation in a completely new and productive direction. I'm trying to think of which one to start with. I had a question about language. Maybe this can be a good segue. Um, so we I wanted to title the event Poetry and Resistance, not simply because there's definitely a political horizon to your collection, but there's also resistance and tension on multiple levels. Poem's resistance to its own conformity, the book's resistance and tension with its form, and there's definitely a bit of a tension or resistance between the speakers in these poems and language. So kind of connecting back, maybe going back to Heidegger and thinking about language. I was wondering what your relationship with language is, and whether in these poems, one thing that caught my eye is that the word words comes up frequently in the collection. So the language itself becomes a thing at question in these poems. What is your relationship with language as a poet, and how is language involved in our world if we were to take that a step further?
Yeah, thank you. So I, I feel very tender for this question because I think my interest in this was one of the great failures of this book, and that is not a sad thing. I had an opportunity to visit with one of my mentors, Khaled Matawa, the poet, is now at Michigan. Years before that, he was at UT Austin, so he was my thesis advisor at UT Austin. And around 2018, he came out, he did a reading in Tucson, and I was driving him around, and I said, I'm just kind of disappointed in this second book of mine. I don't think it realized what I hoped it would realize, not in terms of response, but just in terms of my own aspirations for the book. And he said, that's okay. You'll just work it out in the next book. And so he had this way of being very at peace with the fact that we kind of get haunted by certain questions, and then we keep working them out, even though for me, it's very important to find new angles of approach, which is why I mentioned before that I really wanted formally to react against my second book and to teach myself something new. So I think that's where there's agency for us as poets, as writers. We can set ourselves up to learn something new with every book. But there's also a kind of peace in accepting and a kind of humility in accepting that maybe we'll just be haunted by the same questions and we can keep working on them. So what are words? I don't think this book did a great job of thinking through that. But I guess I can say I think about this question in two directions at once. So one is a very rational one, a very kind of post-lyric, where we say, and these are commonplaces in the discourse around poetry, right? We say things like, well, these are poems that self-consciously call attention to their material, which is language, and therefore they seek to denature the subjective lyric I and the speaking voice, right? We are denaturing the fiction of a coherent subject with a coherent biography who will speak coherently from one position. And so I am interested in artifice in that way. I am interested in creating uh, patterning language and creating tension in poems that calls attention to the poem as a made thing to denature the subject. Take that very seriously. But when folks speak about that way in poems, there's a little bit of a puffing up of our chest, like, oh, we killed the lyric subject. We're smarter than poetry, right? So we're going to do poetry from outside of poetry. And that's cool. And I don't dismiss it and I practice it. Simultaneous to that, I'm really interested in language as a tool for spiritual co-creation with the world, which is a kind of mystical register of language. Um, and for me, I have to keep that door open because to me, that is a way of looking, trying to peek beyond Western culture that I'm embedded inside of, right? And so in that more mystical vein, I was really struck by a couple of things that Alice Notley has said and written, the poet Alice Notley. One of them was at a reading here in Tucson. She stopped it in between poems and she said, well, obviously, and I'm paraphrasing, she said, obviously, poetry is the greatest art. Nothing comes close. Nothing could ever come close. No painting, no music, no composition, no dance could ever come close. And she had a way of saying extreme things with a lot of conviction. It was her vibe. But I think I'm pretty sure she meant that she believes language is one of the technologies or a central technology for creating reality, and not just in our heads, but in some kind of relationship with the world. And then the second thing that she says is inside of a poem. She says, we are the masters of hearing and saying at the double edge of body and breath. At the double edge of body and breath. And so that image conjures for me one of those, a Mobius strip, right? In geometry, a Mobius strip kind of turns on itself. You can't quite untangle it. And so it's this idea that language and breathing is a way to create a kind of reciprocity between the inside and the outside with the body. And so it's a physical reciprocity because it's air and breath and molecules of air, but it's also in a conceptual one because language carries ideas, it carries the baggage of images and concepts and such. So in that way, I think that's where I failed in this book to really kind of make that palpable or explicit or apparent. But that's why I'm interested in prosody, right? So years ago, I thought prosody was an imposition, and one could go so far as to say a disciplining imposition. But I just don't care anymore. I don't care about reacting against that anymore. I'm not interested in creating poems that match recognized prosodies, but I am interested in bringing an awareness to my own sense of the line. And Alice Notley says this as well in an essay in the book coming after. Maybe somebody could find the link to that. It's a great book of her craft essays from I think University of Michigan Press. And she says she's writing in the 90s, I think, early 2000s, and she says it's like people thought anything there was to say about the line was already said in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And so from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, um, we just ended up imitating each other's personalities. And and it's kind of pathetic, she said, like for young poets, because now all we have is a poor copy of someone else's disposition or someone else's attitude. And she says it's important, she thinks, to develop your own sense of your ear, not to match anyone else's sense of what musicality could or couldn't be, but to really articulate your own. She says a line is its events. So don't worry so much about the ending of a line being end stopped or enjammed, or there's a third kind called annotated that James Loganbach talks about. She says, think about the events inside the line. And the events inside the line are the sounds that happen. And here again, I tend to think of an aquarium, and then the prosody is a kind of sloshing back and forth inside the line. So you can pull the energy back, right? When if you start with uh, the stress on the first syllable and then release it into iams, if that were something you were interested in. There's all kinds of things you can do once you start paying attention in that way. And you don't have to become a master of classical prosody to do it. And you don't have to pledge allegiance to classical prosody to start to develop that awareness. And so that's an aesthetic awareness, and we can dismiss it. We can say, but that's decorative. And because it's decorative, it's apolitical and it's not urgent. And and I will not make my poems pretty in this moment of extreme violence. And that's, again, that's cool. Go for it. But what I'm saying is that to me, aesthetics is not decorative. It is potentially mystical. And I say potentially because I still have a question mark. I'm still trying to learn what words are and what language is, right? But I take very seriously what the poet and theorist Fred Moten says when he says aesthetics don't have to be decoration. Think of them as the opposite of anesthetics. So if anesthesia puts you to sleep, there's a lot of violence that can be done to you once you're asleep. Aesthetics can be a way to wake you up, to sensitize the body, to sensitize the awareness. Um, so So again, two major planks of how this book is thinking about language. One is artifice, as clearly this is not a traditional lyric subject speaking from a unified position, but also I'm claiming my right to my own relationship to elegance and and sensuality in my work, regardless of what other folks might how other folks might dismiss those strategies or not. Um, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is personally at least one of the most important and valuable lessons I've learned from your poetry. Um, and I have I'm gonna make it like quick comment about my own experience. And I have one of my great friends, poet friends from Turkey in the chat. And if I misrepresent anything, I'm sure he will correct me later. But having grown up in Turkey and started reading poetry there, reading and writing in poetry in Turkish, and uh, relying on the intellectual capital that was accumulated over there over the years, there was one, if you are gravitated towards, if you're drawn to the left wing politics, the stereotypically where everyone what everyone thinks of in terms of the literary dominant literary aesthetic historically is social realism, which was, of course, shaped and developed under the heavy influence of the Soviet regime, and uh, assuming that kind of that perspective when you approach writing inevitably requires you to prioritize certain things over certain other things, and what you tend to neglect uh, is sometimes those aesthetic questions, which are dismissed as um, apolitical or unworthy of reflection because certain political problems are more urgent. Um, but like in your words, you claiming your right to elegance, I think, restores a lot of essential um, things to art and our discussions around it, and reinvigorates writing and literature on the left, uh, which is very important. Um, I think we have, I will ask one more question and then withdraw and let our audience put their questions in the chat. And if you have questions emerging in your mind, please feel free to put them in the chat right now, and I will be reading them to Farid later in a few minutes. I have one question that maybe can let us end this discussion in a with more insight about the tradition that you feel like you yourself belong to. There's a poem in Moon Mirrored Indivisible titled Concentric, and it opens with the lines, uh, cast under angels, orders of drones, of expositors. I don't know who or what, if I look up, I might offend. However mannered the poem dares, write about the poem. And these lines reminded me of Rilke's Duino elegies, the first elegy specifically that opens with the following, with the lines, who, if I cried out, would hear me among the angels' orders. And even if one of them pressed me suddenly to his heart, I would be consumed in his more potent being. I value questions about literary lineage or what the poets assumed literary lineage is. Um, and you already mentioned Alice Notley and others, but if you were to uh, take a couple of minutes to talk about where you position yourself, what you see as your poetic lineage is, what poets or poetic traditions would you uh, mention in response?
All the good ones. No, I mean, I appreciate the question. And Rilke, that's a very, I'm trying hard for you to pick up that reference in that moment in the poem. Like that is a try hard moment. Like I'm glad you noticed it because the poem was trying to get noticed in that way. In that specific case with Rilke, that's another story of translation. Rilke has two main translators. One is Stephen Mitchell, and I'm so sorry I'm forgetting the other one. And interestingly, folks who know German respect the other translator more. I think, or some folks, I've read the argument that Stephen Mitchell just makes Rilke way too pretty in English. And again, we have a lot of suspicion of prettiness and about, particularly in translation, about quote unquote domesticating something to make it palatable to the target audience's ears, right? But just in that case, I read the Stephen Mitchell translations of Rilke, and by the way, he does an amazing version of Job from the Old Testament as a standalone book. I read those in graduate school, and it was one of the first times that my body and mind intuitively heard musicality in a poem, but had no idea what I was hearing or why I was hearing it that way. Um, so I guess what I'm saying is that that's not an intentional lineage. That is a circumstantial. I happened to find this book, and it made a deep impression on me at a particular moment. Um, I mean, I can list off folks. There's the Black Mountain, Charles Olson, and then a little after Ed Dorn, and then the folks that they were friendly with in the Bay Area. So Joanne Kiger is a huge influence. Um, I learned about all of those folks from two contemporary poets who are brilliant. They're now based in Toronto. They are a couple. Her name is Hua Nguyen, Hoanguyen. His name is Dale Smith. And I was incredibly lucky to live in Austin with them as I was finishing graduate school. And I really, uh, my particular graduate program, I was not a great fit for that program and vice versa. So when I was done with my MFA, I was pretty ready to stop and move on, maybe get a PhD. And I met Dale and Wah, and they were really like a second MFA to spend time with them. Um, they ran a press, they had a reading series. Anyway. Um, and other, Alice Notley is a huge influence. More recently, Emily Dickinson is a strong influence. From a different angle, the Salvadoran revolutionary poet Roque Dalton, I think, is really brilliant and amazing. Who's killed. Um, from a different angle, yet again, Cesar Vallejo and Lorca. I'm not sure that really anyone, and Paul Celan. I feel like I don't know that folks have innovated with language more than Vallejo and Celan, ever. Um, so it's a grab bag, and I'm okay with it being a grab bag. I came up at a time, I don't know how you guys feel, very curious to hear from graduate students now. Um, in the early 2000s, we were still enmeshed in the wars between the avant-garde and the not avant-garde, the traditional, the narrative, the straight ahead, whatever you want to call it, the raw and the cooked. Um, and and there were all the generation above us had chips on their shoulders about who had access to university jobs, who was recognized by prizes. Um, and it was none of that was very inspiring. And so I'm very comfortable not claiming a camp of poetry and following a kind of law of attraction. You're in a bar, who's cute? Who are you vibing with? Um, and and that's not a flippant answer for me, I do believe we reach for what we need to advance our practice, even if we don't know why or what we're reaching for exactly. So 5 years ago, I could have cared less about Emily Dickinson or Paul Celan, and now I'm very interested in them. Um, so yeah, it's a grab bag, and I guess not that anyone's asking for my advice, but I would say um, follow follow your gut for what you are vibing with in the moment. Love it deeply, read it deeply, internalize it, and then move on without feeling like you have to stay within a certain lane or lineage of poetry.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your insightful answers. As I was listening, I was also taking notes that I'm 100% sure that will be personally very, very helpful to me. I want to um, read some questions from the chat. We have a couple, and we encourage our audience to um, put in more. We have about 15 minutes. First question is from Hüseyin Sönmez, a Turkish poet. He says, some thinkers believe that conceptual art has replaced philosophy in the 20th century. In this sense, poetry seems to have been excluded from thought. What are your thoughts on this as a personal curiosity?
That's such a cool question. Thank you. So, so I don't I don't think poetry is excluded from thought because I think inside of poems. It may be excluded from larger narratives of how philosophy comments on itself and advances. Um, and that's okay. There's people who play baseball and there's people who talk about baseball. Like there are just different discourses, right? I hate baseball, by the way. I do neither. I don't play it or talk about it, but if you do, that's great. Um, that poem, All Right, You Lightheaded Fathers, that has the list, John Bolton, Elliot Abrams, Juan Cerate of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Here I'm told is a song, George Zimmerman, whose countryman, to me is an act of thinking and questioning. George Zimmerman is alive today. He is the Peruvian American murderer of Trayvon Martin. So on paper, George Zimmerman shares a subject position or an identity position with me. We are both Peruvian Americans, right? George Zimmerman chose to become a vigilante for whiteness, or was socialized to become a vigilante for whiteness. And so that question, whose countryman, asked in the song of This Country 'Tis of Thee, right? Asked in that melody. And after the list of neocon people who actually have activated on the bihemispheric political situation, like those three people really have shaped the bihemispheric political situation. And George Zimmerman is just a guy who had a gun, who killed a black teenager. Um, so through the artifice of a persona poem, there's a person who's speaking that poem. It's kind of a baby who's coming into consciousness and saying, well, what world is this that I'm coming into and that I'm learning the rules of? That poem can think and question by sequencing. It can think and question by the fiction of persona. It can think and question by the marriage of word and song. So to me, poems are incredible tools for thinking. They just have tools or ways of operating that maybe are not legible as the rational discourse of philosophy, where you kind of rehearse someone else's argument and then find what's useful about it and then question some of the premises of that argument and offer your own counter position. Poems may not work in that way, but I think they're incredibly valuable instruments to think with because you can think and feel at the same time. And that is that layering of thinking and feeling is what's exciting to me inside of or in poetry.
Mhm. Thank you. It also reminded me of something that you said in an interview for Mizna, where you say, I eventually began to think of craft as a multifarious thing that could be connected to one's entire sense of existence. I guess poetry itself can, whatever is included in it through craft or through more like elements of content, is a reflection on what surrounds one's existence and what constitutes one's existence. So either way, I can see how it can be thinking, either on the self or on what lays a siege around the self. Um, we have another question from Sandra Liu. They say, do you feel like you approach poetry in different ways when writing in English versus in Spanish, like the issues you tend to lean towards?
It's a good question. I'm comfortable speaking Spanish, translating from it. You can drop me in any Spanish-speaking country. Me podría defender, puedo conversar. I'm not comfortable. I don't feel that I have my full capacities in Spanish. I came from Peru when I was 6. I'd lost my Spanish by the time I was 9, and then I've been working to get it back ever since. Through classes, through living in different Spanish-speaking places, through translation. And so if you bracket out the translation work I've done and just look at the composition work I've done, my own poems, 98% is written in English and very little is in Spanish. In fact, there's a poem I took out of this manuscript that only lives as a broadside now that's written fully in Spanish. So I guess when I try to write in Spanish, I feel like my footprint where I feel safe becomes very small. Um, and so I advance through line by line. Um, whereas when I'm writing in English, I feel confident making these huge swerves from one line to the next. I believe there's a very clear reasoning between them because I take the sequencing in poems very seriously. Um, uh, but in Spanish, I feel much more timid. I feel much more timid, and my Spanish, I can definitely work with a dictionary and I can adapt in a conversation. But there's a lot of ways in which the Spanish I feel comfortable with is the Spanish I heard as a little kid. So I'm listening. It's a gendered Spanish. It's a Spanish that is stamped in time because I was listening to women who were born in the late 30s, 1940s, speaking in the 1970s, 1980s, with other women. There were just no men around. Like my father wasn't around. There were no men around. So it's really interesting to reflect on the ways in which the Spanish I was steeped in was a particular Spanish, not Spanish writ large, not Spanish as a whole, because I didn't grow up having to learn academic Spanish, professional Spanish, business Spanish, right? Um, so, so I'm timid when I go to write in Spanish, but that's kind of interesting to me too, to feel small and childlike again. That's not a bad position from which to write a poem.
Thank you. Looks like we don't have any other questions, but we please, on behalf of our audience, on behalf of the BMI, allow me to thank you and express our gratitude and appreciation for being with us today. I had a lot, I learned a lot from this conversation, and I hope our audience felt the same way. Thank you, and thank you, everyone in our audience, for attending Poetry and Resistance. And we hope to see you at our next virtual event on Thursday, April 9th, titled Seeking Meaning Through a Latino Futurist Lens, a discussion with author Ruben Reyes Jr. and our very own Gustavo Alvarenga about speculative fiction and Latino futurism. You can register for the event for free on blackmountaininstitute.org. And we hope you all have a great rest of your week. Thank you, Farid, for an amazing conversation.
And if folks have other things they want to talk about, don't hesitate to reach out. You can find my website and there's a contact sheet there. Regardless if we just engage at one event or across universities, I do think we are all colleagues in this art of poetry. And I trust that poetry creates opportunities for our paths to cross again and again. So don't hesitate to reach out. And thank you all so much.